really loved working with fibre and with clay, and saw my future as a textile artist. Of course, at the time, that meant going to Melbourne to study art. And my parents, of very good German Lutheran stock, were not going to let their eldest only daughter go to Melbourne and study art. It was get a real job kind of thing. So anyhow, Maggie Beer had approached the high school and she was looking for a second apprentice at the time. This was 1984. And because I'd sort of done a week's, very depressing week's work of kitchen handing at a local motel, and I really hated it. The school decided that she should possibly talk to me. Anyhow, I met Maggie, and of course, most of you would have seen, I'm sure you would have seen Maggie on TV or met her, and I think the whole of Australia has fallen in love with Maggie and her wonderful, passionate, extreme love of life and love of food was what struck me massively when I first met Maggie in 1984. I'll never forget, in the interview with her, she said to me, I can't really explain to you the food that I cook, but if you go into the local newsagent and pick up a copy of Vogue Entertaining magazine at the time, it'll give you a little idea. And I know, I'd grown up with Mettwurst and Streuselkuchen and Bienenstich and all these sort of very German type foods. And so I bought that cover, I bought that magazine, and on the front cover was a bowl of squid ink pasta. Do you remember when squid ink pasta was just so fashionable? Yeah. Well, I saw the cover of that magazine and all I could see was fibre, textile artwork, and I thought, well, if food could look like this, there must be something for me. So, and then of course started working with Maggie and tasted what she cooked, and I thought if food could taste like this would be something for me. So 4.5 years later, of learning to cook by instinct, Maggie was never trained. She cooks, as in her words, by the seat of her pants. So she cooks and she makes decisions, she has an idea, but it's never fully formed. She decides as the pan is sizzling, as the ingredients are coming together in an extremely creative, dynamic way. That was the way I learned to cook. Extreme, artistic, creative, all those things that I was very much looking for. So it was an incredible apprenticeship. I met Chris. We spent about a year together, and then I took off and did my backpacking around the world. I went to Alaska, Anchorage. I worked in Anchorage for a while. I actually did some catering for the Anchorage Opera. We were on a train going to a glacier with opera singers walking up and down the carriage as we were passing out food, very theatrical. Amazing time I'd spent on Vancouver Island working for a Chilean woman, very passionate and of course very fiery, so it was a very interesting, different food that I learnt to work with her. Crossed to Europe, did a little bit of time in London, a little bit of time in Germany. Having that German background, I learnt to speak German in Switzerland, and if anyone here knows a little bit about Switzerland, all the different languages and the dialects, and certainly Swiss German is a spoken language, it's not a written language, so I'm listening to Swiss German in one ear and having to speak High German in that, so it was a really interesting, intense sort of 6 months of learning a language. But it gave me a great appreciation of that cultural background of certainly the European reverence and respect for food, the historical importance and the ritual of food. Chris and I travelled a lot through the country, Italy and France, and we just loved that simplicity and the quality and the great sense of place. When you go to a little village and you eat food of that region, it's absolutely quintessential of that region. You can't get that food anywhere else. So this connection with food and place and people, I think, was cemented not only from my own background, but from a lot to do with those travels. And I know now when people travel, food is so much a part of their experience. So to cut this sort of very long story short, nearly 10 years ago, we were in South Fremantle. We lived there for 20 years, had 2 young children. My husband's a cabinet maker and had started a business. It was incredibly busy, but we were both looking for a sea change, a tree change. We were looking to go back to where we both actually loved, and we wanted to give our children a country childhood. So on one Saturday morning, I picked up the West Australian, looked in the real estate agent section, and saw this tiny little ad. 5 acres, surrounded by an old pear orchard, dam, old shed, 110,000. And I thought, this might be something to have a look at. But it of course wasn't what it kind of, you can conjure up all these amazing sort of visions of what it might be. But it was surrounded by radiata pine, and of course my husband hates radiata pine. He was never going to settle on a block with pine trees around it. But it got us looking, and we then found a property that had some existing holiday accommodation cottage on it. And the kind of process of going through how it would be to actually completely up stumps, completely shift our life, and how we could use our background and our skills to create something quite special in that particular area. We had some idea at the time that it was very strong in agriculture and quite special in wine, because we knew Bill Pannell had started Picardy. Of course, Bill Pannell started Mosswood in Margaret River many years ago with his wife Sandra. So he's established his vineyard Picardy, and we knew John Broxop was there. John Broxop was the head viticulturist at Lewin Estate for many years, and he retired there and also started growing grapes. So we kind of thought, well, if these 2 pioneers of West Australian wine decided that Pemberton was the place for them, we thought there must be something pretty magic here. So we bought this property, which was originally called Pemberton Breakaway Cottages, and 3 years after we moved, Chris started building some new chalets. I then applied for a National Tourism grant called a TQL grant, and that allowed us to build what we call the field kitchen, which is a simple building. It has capacity to seat 50 people, and it has a kitchen that we use for both cooking classes and as a restaurant kitchen. And we modelled that concept, we modelled that idea on these wonderful experiences we'd had when we were travelling through Europe. And I have to admit too, to falling a little bit in love with Hugh Fernand's story. Like many people. The whole river cottage phenomenon, that first book that came out. And Hugh really started that amazing sort of movement again of it's just the wheel turning around again, really, of being self-sufficient, self-reliant, looking at what you have in your region, what you're able to grow in a garden, what you're able to produce and work with other growers in your area. So all these sort of strands had come together to create what we now call forages. And so over that 7-year period, we'd come to know a lot of amazing people in our area. In fact, 3 days after we moved there, we heard this very old clapped out tractor come rumbling down the road. And on the tractor was this incredibly wonderful, relatively young Italian farmer. His arms were going like this, and he was shouting at the top of his voice, and he was welcoming us to this region. And at the same time, he was selling us firewood and buckwheat. And I thought, what an amazing thing that, a local farmer is growing buckwheat. I've never heard of white buckwheat being grown in Western Australia. He's been growing that for about 20-30 years, because his family brought the seed out with them from the Valtellina region, which is in the north of Italy. And so much of the food that they cooked in that region was very much based on buckwheat. So this sense of culinary heritage was very much through some of the people we've met as well. The northern Italians, the southern Italians, and also a big Macedonian community in Manjimup we'd sort of got to know through starting a slow food convivium some years prior to opening forages. So it's an incredibly rich community of not only produce, but this wonderful culinary heritage that I thought was incredibly important to document and to capture. So the book idea was just an extension of these wonderful relationships and this great sense of community. And also being aware, after talking to so many of the people that were coming to stay with us, that so many Western Australians were completely unaware of the fact that probably most of the fresh food that they'd been eating all their life had come from this area. The pink lady apples, the fact that the pink lady apples started their actual commercial production in Majima. We just celebrated their 40th year of commercial production. It's now an apple that's grown all over the world, but it's a very well-kept secret that it actually started in Majima. Of course, we have the truffles, and now Majima, and certainly Pemberton as well, has now become synonymous with truffles. We're the largest commercial truffle growing region in Australia, producing some beautiful quality. And so as you're seeing all these beautiful photographs rolling through, you'll see the great diversity that's in the area. And as I've got to know a lot of these growers, I've got to understand how incredibly special the climate, the environment, the soil, the water, and why it's possible that so many different things can grow. Everything from saffron, would you believe? I got to know a biologist who works at the Parks and Wildlife, who some years ago smuggled a few saffron palms in his backpack back from Tasmania. And over the years, after dividing these saffron palms, he now has a very small amount of saffron for commercial production. His family do all that incredibly laborious picking of those little pistils, the saffron pistils, and drying them. And from saffron to avocados to limes to marron, of course, and finding this chap who goes around and fishes for redfin perch out of the dams, which of course are a terrible pest and eat all of the marron, but someone who's trying to sort of develop a commercial production based on a terrible pest. You've got some really wonderful, incredibly entrepreneurial, resilient, strong people that have had to face enormous adversity with the change in the forestry, with climate and agriculture, as I'm sure most of you would be aware, the highs and lows that goes along with actually farming and being resilient enough to still survive. It's some amazing stories and some amazing people and some incredible families that are now still multi-generational, continuing on what their forefathers have actually done. And of course, if some of you have been in our area and seen the massive girth of those carry trees and thought about how it was possible that they clear these trees to make it even viable to grow something, is quite an extraordinary feat. So I have enormous respect for these growers and a great appreciation of what they've actually been through to provide the food that we all actually enjoy and eat, and not really know who's actually grown it. So the book was very much about that, and very much also about writing some pretty nice recipes to attach to those products. My sort of fascination, I suppose, with food, to come back to a sort of full circle and talking about creativity, my fascination with food is so much about flavour and texture and how the idiosyncrasies of those things happen on the plate. One of the things that has fascinated me over the last 2 years is plants that reside in the same botanical family often have the most incredible synergy in terms of their flavour. And one of the recipes in the book is for a very simple dish. It's an avocado that's filled with pickled ginger and pine nuts and cinnamon. And of course, cinnamon, basil and avocado are all sort of wonderful little partners, and they all reside within that family. So that's certainly something that's got me on a path of much discovery, and I'm sure there's a whole lifetime of wonderful experimentation and joy ahead when you sort of start to think about the way that food, the history of food, the domestication of food, the wild food, the way that food connects to culture and place. I think it's an incredibly exciting time to be where we are Western Australia has, we really have grown enormously over the last 20 years, and I think we still have a lot of discovery yet to sort of enjoy and uncover. So that's a little bit about sort of, I mean, that's sort of a kind of a potted history of how we've ended up in Pemberton. I'd probably like to know from you now how many of you have actually visited the area. And the other interesting thing that I generally ask people when they've come to stay with us, you know, when was the last time they visited? And often the answer is they came with their children. Or it was a school camp. The associations with Pemberton often is Pemberton Camp School, or it's trout fishing. So there's some really lovely stories there that people often share with their connection with the place. But I'd like to hear some of your stories as well, because I think having a connection, a historical connection to place, makes it incredibly interesting when you start thinking about the food and what your experiences are with food. So if anyone wants to volunteer, perhaps a little story of their own from their visits of the area, I'd love to hear.
I haven't got a story from the southwest, but I was interested to hear you say about the food that you picked up in your recipes from France and Italy. You didn't stress on Italy all that much and where favourites are there. Can you tell me, have you visited Tuscany, Elsa d'Elsa, San Ambiato, or across the M4 where you get to Gubbio and Sant'Egidio, where favourites Italy, and I thought you may have brought that back into Australia, into your book. Have you done it, because we haven't read your book?
Not really. I think the Italian element in the book is really through the story of the migrants that have come into our area. So the family in particular that I have written about is the Della Franca family, and they were the buckwheat growers, and they're from the north, so that's a very mountainous region. There is also another story of a man who originally came from Tuscany, and in fact there were quite a few Italians from that region that came to Manjimup. The Fontanini brothers came from Tuscany.
I'm with you, yes.
They settled, well, in fact, the Fonte's Pool.
Yeah.
Fonte's Pool was settled, well, was actually developed by Archimedes Fontanini. And he and his brother actually settled. There were two farms, and they started growing vegetables, and they used to actually take it by horse and cart to Bridgetown in the very early days to sell. And then he changed to orchards, or his brother actually went off more into the orchards, and he was very clever with water, and so he had this sort of dammed area that ended up being a swimming hole for a lot of local kids, and then of course he extended that to turn into that beautiful
by gravity
pool. Yes, yeah. So there's a wonderful history of Tuscans in Manjimup as well, along with Louis Bazzani, who's actually, he hasn't been there as long as the Fontanini brothers. His life actually started out in Perth. He was a nurseryman. He actually had a long history in developing roses, and then he went on to develop olives. In fact, his family business now probably is one of the largest commercial suppliers of olive trees for olive plantations in Australia.
Wow.
So he's been incredibly entrepreneurial and very resilient.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, I mean, like all,
Thank you.
It's very much a part of the Italian culture, I think, is that extreme work ethic and entrepreneurial. And I think it's quite interesting to look at the history of the area and to see how in the very beginning with the group settlers, and how many of the English migrants that were there had absolutely no experience in farming. It was a terrible travesty to actually throw them into such a region, expect them to be able to dairy farm.
Yeah, they stood on their feet and got up the top, didn't they?
Well, the Macedonians, the Italians, the Greeks, the ones that, the migrants that probably had more experience with working the land, more adept at hard work, whereas many of the English migrants did not have that background, and for them it was just a terrible struggle. So yeah, there's very much a strong Italian connection there. Yes.
So basically, I was brought up in my early years in Esperance, and I know, and I've got a question coming from that moment, that what we ate came from what Dad grew in the vegetable patch, what we call the ocean or the rabbit's mum caught. So my question would be, when you're formulating the recipe or a meal, does it start with the produce or with the idea?
You know, it's not really, it's never really one thing. It can be, it can certainly happen that I end up with, someone brings me a sack of potatoes and it may be a new variety. And so I start with that, and then I look at how that potato works, whether it's floury, whether it's waxy, what the flavour is, and then I start to look at those attributes and how far I can push it in terms of flavour, and also the technique that needs to match in with what the attributes of that product can provide, what it can give. Whereas other things have a very strong relationship to culinary heritage. So, for example, the buckwheat. And it was just wonderful to get to know John's mother and some of the traditional dishes that she still cooks, and she's 80-something. And pizzoccheri, which is a very well-known pasta dish made with buckwheat. So I took the concept of the traditional dish is actually these very wide, almost fettuccine-style buckwheat noodles that get cooked with potato and with cabbage. It's drained, it's put into a baking dish, and then there's garlic butter and sage and cheese put on. It's very sturdy, very rich.
Sounds divine.
Oh, it's divine. And so then that's baked. And so I took the idea of putting a leafy green vegetable with potato, with the buckwheat, and made the galette. So it's a kale, potato and buckwheat galette. So I made a pastry with the buckwheat, laid potato in the bottom, cooked kale in some garlic butter, and put sage leaves on top, and that's the other element for that traditional dish. And I've used the elements of what makes that dish so special, but I've changed the way that all those different ingredients come together. So there's ways in which you can go from either the ingredient or perhaps a connection, a cultural connection to it, or even a person, the character of a person can come into it as well. I think it's never one pathway, and that's what makes food such a creative endeavour. I think it's the same with anything. It's the same with music, with language, with any art. I think it's it sounds a bit of a cliche, but I think it is with whichever creative endeavour. I think it's whatever's inspiring you at the time. Yeah.
Sophie, I was born in Pemberton a long while ago. My mother came out. She was the youngest of 11 children on the MB Castle in 1910, and they settled out on the Byron, and the property is now owned by Dr. Ryan's son, Tony Ryan.
Okay.
Out there, and so she was the youngest of 11, deceased now, of course. And by the way, I left Pemberton and to go to school in 1952 or 53, but I know the area very well. My father was a surveyor, and he went down there, and my mother and they got married and had a business in Pemberton for a long while.
What business went to?
He had the potato contract, the hops contract when it was run out there in Buns.
Yes.
And the garage and mail run, all that sort of thing.
Yes.
Going out, and I mean, it's a fantastic place.
Yeah, it is.
And I think the avocados they have in Pemberton are certainly the best I've ever seen. I've just come back from Vietnam, and I've been there a few times, and they have avocados there, they say are good, but there's nothing like Pemberton avocados.
Do you know we actually supply, what's so good and what's actually so fortunate with avocados grown in our area is that it's the alternate season to Queensland.
Yes.
So what that means is 70% of Australia's needs of avocados come from our area.
And all along Channybarra Road,
Oh, it's the,
that's just,
it is,
and they're better than New Zealand.
avocado belt, yes.
And we used to live on, and we had a big veranda on the house, and we, the house out the farm, but our house in town as well. And you'd always be hanging up a couple of sides of kangaroo and marron and pike from Windy Harbour and the bridge. The whole lot was just on tap, all the rabbits, of course.
Yes.
Rabbits all the time. But no, I agree, and I've heard of breakaway cottages, and I've always heard good reports about that.
Well, that's very good.
Yeah. Well, there's lots down there now.
Yeah.
Plenty. And I go back sometimes and canoe down the mouth of Dolly, and sometimes we stay at Kerry Valley. And it's just a fantastic place.
Do you know what's so interesting too when you uncover people's stories in this region is how adept they had to be. Like the beef grower that's in the book, the Delagoldas.
Yeah.
His parents actually used to run the telephone exchange, and at the same time they were farming cattle. They were, doing a run with parcels. They were doing so many different things, and that's what I've always loved so much about country life or country living is this wonderful exchange, this generosity of spirit. It's not measured, it's only ever given, of a willingness, of a sort of a wonderful sense of generosity, because that's what you do, because one day you may need that generosity back. And we have so loved that as part of our life.
And most of the Italian boys that were interned during the war, they went back to Italy, and if they were sponsored to come back by the farmers, they married the farmers' daughters, and did very, very well. Lots of them are there down there.
There's a couple more questions this summer on this side. Lady at the back.
Yeah, we are blessed with a son-in-law from Ranjama, and they are the most amazing people. There's no change of money between anybody in that town. We trade cherries for the apples and everything, a haircut for something else. I just love them. And you never go down to Ranjama from them. They're hugging on the trees and coming back with a whole trunk full of fresh, the best veggies and fruit.
You have this wonderful sense, you do get this wonderful sense of just, that the best of human spirit when you do get this enormous exchange of generosity, and it's not measured, as you say. Beautiful. I have to say though, there's great and fierce rivalry between football clubs. And all the sort of that sense of resilience and winning is all channeled through their sport. So they will love you to death, but on the football field they'll play you to death. So there's this wonderful sense of community spirit in whichever way they do, as passionate as what they are.
Gentleman here.
Yes.
How long did you say you've been down? Was it about 20 years?
No, 10 years actually. It was January the 5th, 2005 that we settled there. So
No, about 15 years ago, the people proved to give a tremendous opportunity to my son.
Right.
He was the young chef, and he became the chef at Gloucester Ridge.
Okay.
And Don, I can't think of his name.
Don Hancock.
Don Hancock, that's right. He's very entrepreneurial.
Yes.
And he gave my son the opportunity to go to Hong Kong to promotion of Australian food promotion. From there he got a job in China, which he became a part of the expat scene with chefs, and he ended up as an executive chef in one of the large hotels up in China. So,
Do you know, I was talking to one of the matriarchs of Pemberton on Saturday night. She came for dinner, and Lorna Drake is her name. She and her family built the Gloucester Motel many years ago. And we were talking about all these different times and changes in the evolution of towns. And I think, every generation has the opportunity to be entrepreneurs. Every generation has the opportunity to see what's around them and to look what the world needs and to match those two things together. And I think we've been very fortunate to be where we are, because now people are so interested in food and travel, and our region is just sitting there waiting for the world to discover. And I think we're incredibly lucky to be there at the right time. So I would encourage you all to rediscover this beautiful area. And by the way, there's some confusion too with our regional name. Southern Forests sometimes gets confused with the Great Southern. So we've got Margaret River, of course, in the west. We've got the Warren Blackwood River, which takes in Bridgetown, Balingup and Nannup. Then we've got the Southern Forest, which actually does have a coastline. It's got 140 kilometres of beautiful southern coastline. And then we've got the Great Southern. So Walpole is actually a part of the Southern Forests. And then just on the other side of Walpole it becomes the Denmark Shire, which is part of the Great Southern region. So it's a bit confusing with Southern Forest and Great Southern, but that's sort of our little patch. Is anyone else with any other questions?
Just some of the photographs. I'm curious about what some of the things are.
Okay.
You've got the tiny carry-on walls.
Oh, the finger limes. So finger limes, which are a native Australian fruit. In fact, they're originally from Queensland, and the shape is about so long, and you cut them in half, and you squeeze out this caviar-like fruit, and it pops in your mouth like caviar, but it's citrus, and it has the most beautiful flavour. And I have a recipe in the book with marron and avocado and finger lime. It's just a beautiful match of flavours and textures. So we've got this is the red king perch, which I've cooked in the salt. Of course, the saffron. Most amazing thing to see on the ground. I mean, you cannot see saffron plants there, but you will begin that this is a Cornish saffron bread or a cake that's made with currants, and this is, of course, this is the Southerners Football Club. They make their sausages each year. In fact, they get auctioned off, would you believe, to raise money for the club, which I thought was and this is buckwheat polenta, which is served with this homemade sausage. This is trout. Of course, trout has a very interesting history in our area. I think it was 1941, a school teacher decided on an experiment and was able to get a trout fingerling from the east, released it into the East Brook, and a year later discovered that it survived. And then the trout hatchery society came about, and they built some trout ponds, and then the fisheries until today now have released trout into the local waterways for angling. So that's quite nice. Of course, the truffles, which we all now know from our particular area. So, and of course the wild. This is a chanterelle. In fact, this was on a walk behind our property, just in the Brockman State Forest, and that's a grain, a lovely salad with the wild mushrooms, and that's a ubiquitous photo of driving through the area through the Karri Forest. We've got an organic beetroot and kale grower in Manjimup. Cauliflower, of course, there was a massive export industry in cauliflower that came out of Manjimup. Beautiful cherries. We've just had the cherry festival. Of course, in Manjimup was last weekend. It happens every second weekend. Beautiful Angus. We've got tamarillos. We've got the largest tamarillo grower in Australia, would you believe, in our area. Green tea. That's another industry that's poised to happen. Beautiful honeycomb. I mean, again, another just beautiful oak tree that's just a classic kind of scene driving through. This is a lovely leaf tart. That's a macadamia, salted caramel butter. Beautiful pears. That's a dish that I've made with the pink lady apples. It's a chicken dish. Beautiful figs, smoked duck, radicchio, pickled walnuts. We've got a pickled walnut producer in Manjimup. lots of roadside stalls. We've just had a shop actually open in Manjimup called the Cherry Box, and they sell a lot of local produce as well. Of course, this is the Arboretum, the Big Brook Dam Arboretum. It's the most amazing species of different trees. The pink lady apple, of course. This is a chocolate quince and licorice tart. Pickled plums on a open toasted sandwich. A really beautiful apricot pistachio cheesecake. We've got an amazing chap. We talk about self-reliant. He grows asparagus. He's not a commercial grower, but again, he'll just grow and give and as gifts. This is one of the larger of the avocado growers, the Gibson family, and that was the dish I was talking about before with the purple basil and the lime and
Cinnamon.
cinnamon. Another dish with the avocados as well, just a simple, lovely salad. We've got a very large iceberg lettuce grower. In fact, most of his iceberg lettuces go to all the fast food chains and a lot of the suppliers for the big ships that come and go. So, and that's actually cooked iceberg lettuce, would you believe, which is very common in French and Chinese cuisine, but not so common in our own. These two are amazing. She's Thai, and they do look like bush people, but they are really quite interesting people. They grow bamboo, and they grow bamboo for eating and also for construction. And G pickles bamboo, and they grow beetle leaves, if you're familiar with Thai food. Most beautiful. This is the Delagola family. Most beautiful beef, smoked tomatoes, kale pesto. That's a sugar-cured beef dish with kohlrabi and apple. Beautiful organic beetroot. Well, it just keeps going on. I think I might let you discover the rest in the book. Yes.
Question.
Yes.
In winter, up here in Perth,
Yes.
often in winter, Coles or RGA will be selling the colleagues for $2 or $1.70. If
Yes.
they're selling at that price, what is the farmer growing and getting for $1?
Well, that's a really good question. It depends on where they're from, I suppose, and it depends too on gluts. And if a farmer has a lot, then often they get less, but they're selling a lot more. So I actually can't answer that question.
Because it takes a long time to grow a cauliflower, so that's the concept of that.
Sure. Sure. It's a very good question. It's a very complex answer. Yeah.
I would have thought the answer would be long.
I think you're right. Yes, I mean it's a really complex layer of supply and demand and how it gets distributed, and it's a very interesting conversation to have with the grower. And most of them will tell you that what they receive as growers hasn't changed significantly, but their input costs have skyrocketed, and they are pushed constantly up against the wall. Particularly talking to the beef grower and of course the cauliflower grower. You know, they're price takers, they're not price makers, and that's the great struggle, I think, with agriculture in this country is they can never actually set the price that they need. It's a complex labyrinth of how farming is in this country. It's unsubsidised, of course there's arguments for and against that as well, and free trade also makes an incredibly complex situation.
The whole gourmet thing having any influence on getting a higher price?
Well, I think it certainly creates a demand, but again, the ratio between the cost of growing and the cost of what comes in is something that's not necessarily dictated by whether you get a recipe in Gourmet Traveller or not. It's a conversation that I don't feel particularly confident to know the answers to that.
A very practical question. Next Wednesday, we're driving from Augusta to Mount Barker. Very likely we'll be around Pemberton at lunchtime. Can you do this? No wine. It's a long drive.
Okay. be two places that spring to mind. And if you're driving from Augusta, you're going to have to come down Bass Highway, which you could very easily just do a left turn up Channy Bearup Road and go to Silkwood.
Yeah.
Or you could go to Hidden River Estate, which is a beautiful spot very near Big Brook Dam. You could actually, in fact, get there the back way, but probably better to go in through Pemberton. But Hidden River or Silkwood, they're the two lunch places.
But no lines. Oh, it has long drive.
They still serve food.
Your work very much reminds me of my mother. And one of the reasons is because she was a ball kicker. She was the first Italian woman that was allowed to go to the shell de la cucina that I see in cooking
I see.
in Italy. Only men could go, even though women cook
That's
day in
interesting.
and day out, right? But because she was a ball kicker, she eventually got it. And what your work reminds me of is one of the great statements that she made to me when I was a little kid, and that led me to become a scientist. She said in Italian first, la geografia ci dà la cultura, la cultura ci dà la cucina e la cucina cambia la geografia. In English, geography gives us the culture gives us the kitchen, and unfortunately, the kitchen changes the geography. Isn't that a brilliant statement?
Yeah, that is very interesting.
Isn't that a brilliant statement?
Yeah.
And your work touches on that. I thank you for reminding me of that. And what, I mean, I've been teaching physics, I've been teaching culture, I've been at Curtin, but the point is, it only came to me as you were talking. I've forgotten it, isn't it? So tight and so brilliant.
Food is of the land, and you need to, I think it resonates most when it actually tastes of the land and tastes of the region where it's actually been grown.
Yes.
And that's very much a part of what I try and endeavour to do when we do our dinners, which happen every Saturday night. Every menu is completely different, and it's very much inspired by a place. So, yeah.
That sounds like a very good place to stop. Because I know I can see people just warming up for a whole bunch of more questions. And we, I know there are people who would like to have their books signed before they leave, and there are various commitments that people need to go for. So if you are going to buy a book, and you want it addressed to somebody, Christmas presents, that kind of thing, would you please write the names so that Sophie can get the spelling correct for you on this piece of paper and just pop it in your book so that she knows kind of what to do. Okay, it makes it a lot easier for everybody. So I'll leave that there. And Adam is ready, and we just tested the machine works. So anybody who'd like to do that. But before we close, please join me in thanking Sophie for this wonderful story. Thank you everybody for being here tonight. If you wouldn't mind please putting your glasses on the tables at the rear, I'd appreciate that. And I'll see you in 2015. Yes, please do. I'm going to start the queue down that
Just the glasses. You ready to roll? It does. It's a bit in the way, isn't it?
Do you want to sit down? You want to sit Italian phone gets tired. Watch out for the camera.
Here we go.
About what's